You're listening to the Entrepreneur's Agony Aunt podcast, keeping it real, telling the story like it is, because there are no mistakes that somebody else hasn't already made. Hello, I'm Vicky Brock, and you're listening to the Entrepreneur Agony Aunt podcast. This week I'm joined by Dean Nash, Head of Legal and Compliance at Monzo Bank. Not just a lawyer, but a distinctly entrepreneurial lawyer, and one working in that most regulated of spaces, fintech. The question this week is from a first-time board director, which is actually very exciting because it means that there is at least one out there that doesn't hate me yet. They ask, how do I support a very fast-moving and successful founding team who seem to regard board meetings and any other form of governance as an unnecessary distraction? There's a fine line between creativity and chaos, and there have already been a few legal errors and a distinct lack of consideration to wider regulatory issues, which is why I've been brought in. I can see real risk to the business and conflict between the shareholders and the founders if I don't find a way to balance the approach that has got them successfully to this point with the serious responsibilities they now face. So Dean, welcome. I have this vision in my head that a good chunk of your day is spent herding cats and trying to ensure that these chaotic entrepreneurial types understand which rules really mustn't be broken so that no one lands in trouble or in jail. Is there any truth to that?
Well, thank you, Vicky, for having me. Thankfully, it's nowhere near as dramatic as that. As a bank, albeit a very young one, we have some of the processes in place that you'd expect of a much more mature company. We're pretty good on corporate governance, risk management and compliance, but getting to this point hasn't been super easy, and it's meant a lot of real intellectual honesty about like what processes genuinely add value, which ones don't, which ones are there just because they're just part of the toolkit of what a director or a senior person might bring along to an organisation. I know that I've had to question some of the processes that I had tried to implement and just think twice about, do these actually add value to where the company is right now? Of course, I'm constantly asked, but why? What about this?
Yep.
How about that?
What's the worst that can happen?
Exactly. A dozen times a day. And a really enjoyable part of my job is to, rather than get defensive about that, say, okay, well, good question. Why do we have that? And then just explore that discussion together. It's basically about trying to find, is a process or a rule or a system that we have, is it relevant or suitable to us right now? And so if it isn't right now, then it will come out, and if actually we need a new one, we'll put it in, and that continues to evolve. So I joined about just over a year ago, nearly a year and a half ago now, and we were 40 to 50 people. We're not far off 300 now.
Wow.
In just over a year.
That's amazing. I knew you guys were moving fast. That really is scaling, isn't it?
Yeah. And so it's a very interesting discussion. One week I might have a discussion that says, should we have a process for this thing? And the answer is no, definitely not. And then 2 weeks later, should we have a process? You go, yeah, actually, probably now we should have a process for that thing. When you get to 300 people, that's not to say, oh, you don't trust people anymore, but actually people probably need some direction so they can know, you know what, I am allowed to go onto Twitter and I'm allowed to talk about Monzo. And they just have a bit of direction. And so actually those controls, like introducing some guidelines now, they're not necessarily about, oh, we're trying to mitigate risks, although that is an important part of it. It's also about helping people to speed up their decision making. And I think the point for us around when to introduce a process or a rule or something is primarily driven by, is it going to help us speed up our decision making? Mm-hmm. If it isn't, then you can probably just rely on people's good common sense to a large degree.
I think it's one of the interesting things about this question that this director is asking, because it seems like this team have been successful so far by going fast, probably much as I've tended to do, ask for forgiveness, not permission, and make it up as they go along. And that has worked to a degree. But presumably once that gets into, as you're talking about, once you get into 300 people, once you're getting to a significant customer base like you have, you can't make the same kind of mistakes and ask for forgiveness all of the time in the way that perhaps you did as a small team.
I think there's, in terms of saying to people, okay, you either need to seek permission or you need to seek forgiveness. I don't think we do either of those things, actually. I think what we say to teams is you have a bunch of responsibilities to do things compliantly, to do things in a well-considered fashion, to do things that are, in the best interest of the customer. And we give people full stack teams to execute against a particular problem. Mm-hmm. So, for example, our financial crime team is made up of financial crime analysts, a couple of business leaders, and some engineers. And so if they need to reset some machine learning rules that allow them to identify suspicious transactions, there isn't a formal process they need to go through to get approval, because actually the best people to decide whether that's the right thing is the team themselves. So they have the regulatory expertise, the data, the authority, they have to make the decision, and then they have the engineers to deliver against it. That's not a point around forgiveness or permission. It's
no,
they're running themselves as their own business.
I suppose the forgiveness comes in is if then that kind of goes a little bit wrong and the system doesn't come back up, which occasionally happens, but it's better if people, I get what you're saying, if people are working, they have authority and they have self-determination within clearly defined rules, clearly defined scope of responsibility, then they're able to act in a sort of self-determining and informed way.
Yeah, and I think that approach is largely informed by what type of company we want to be. And so that will go across our strategy, our risk appetite, which of course the board and directors have a huge role to play in. And so in designing what is our risk appetite for example, financial crime risk, of course it is very low. And so one way to manage financial crime risk to such a degree would be to have a centralized approval and sign-off process. And another way may be to have a small expert team that you're satisfied they're an expert team and you're satisfied that they have the right education and knowledge to do what they need to do. And then if you look at the results of what that team produces and there are things that have gone wrong, then you can look at that and say, actually, maybe we need to exert a bit more governance or a bit more control over that thing. And so I think the dynamic between the board and the directors and how close they are to the business in that type of arrangement is probably different to a larger organization where the board is satisfying itself that things are being managed within risk appetite, or they're being done compliantly or properly because they're seeing centralized processes being deployed. If they need to get satisfied that a team, an individual team is doing what it needs to do, then they probably need to get a bit closer to that team, actually.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing when you first get to the stage perhaps where you have a board and then board executive tensions, natural tensions. I mean, I don't necessarily mean tension in a negative sense, but you've got one group of people who've been used to kind of making it up as they go along and go very, very fast, and you've got another group of people going, whoa, hold on here, there's risk, there's responsibilities, there's rules. Presumably there is a process of finding some kind of common ground so that you don't have people paralysed with following rules, but you also don't have things that are simply, you don't have risks coming through that are not on the radar at all.
Yeah, I think I can't actually imagine a founder ever being paralysed for fear of breaking rules.
No, I've been paralysed in board admin, I have to say. I've got to the places where kind of, I've found that I'm spending more time talking to shareholders and boards and the administration around that than I have been to my actual teams. But I think those are phases of growing pains you sometimes go particularly when these dynamics are new.
I think on one hand, governance is one of those things that you don't see a need for until after the event. And then you think, oh, it would have been obvious if we just thought about that thing at that point, then all of this wouldn't have gone wrong. And then it's, now we should, then you kind of steer the ship the other way and put in place a load of checks and balances that are probably overzealous. But when time is of the essence and you're trying to move very, very quickly, governance and controls can, I think, slow you down. They'll also speed you up in one respect because you're not then spending time fixing things that have gone broken.
Presumably you're not spending time second guessing every single decision about whether the right decision has been made.
So I think kind of when you're small and everybody just inherently knows what everyone else is working on, and there is clear transparency over decision making, then introducing governance and controls can feel a bit unnecessary and a bit overburdensome. But when that transparency goes, just because you've got to a certain size or you're not clear on how decisions are being made, then actually governance that informs the things that people need to think about when they're making decisions is a good thing. And actually that's how a director satisfies themselves that without basically sitting in the business all day long, that's how a director will get themselves comfortable that things are being managed in the right way. They'll look at the processes, they'll look at the exceptions from the process, they'll look at data that evidences whether the process is being followed, or that even if it is being followed, that the wrong outcomes are still being arrived at. And actually, if you're only there 2 or 3 days a month, like most directors are, then that's probably the best you can do. If you want to get closer to that, and I would advocate that directors do get closer than that, particularly in a startup. You probably need to turn up to internal meetings and walk the floor and
I think it's really interesting you say that. It's something that I personally felt as I came out of the last business, that I think the board, the individual directors and my teams would have actually benefited from a little bit more time of then coming in and seeing actually how decisions were made about why are we going to use this piece of machine learning, why are we going to focus on this piece of product roadmap for the next 3 months, why is only X% of these sales converting. I think seeing, even if it was just coming in once and observing different teams, I think would have probably revealed to more experienced people than I where there may have been a gap in the process, but would have also reassured where, even if the right outcome wasn't happening each time, the decision-making process behind it was robust.
Yeah. And I think, just doing simple things like having one-to-ones with middle management as a director, that's a hugely powerful way to get much closer to the organisation. That's
really interesting, because I really bang on about CEOs, how they should never abandon the one-to-one, however busy they get. It's a really key thing, but it's actually, I can see why that would be really, really helpful. Is that something you've seen working, or is that a dream of this is how it would work ideally?
No, it absolutely works here at Monzo. We, as a bank, we basically have to comply with the full corporate governance code, which means we have 4 independent non-execs and 4 executive/investor directors, which feels like a very large board for such a, at the time, very small company, growing rapidly though. But actually each director adds a huge amount of value, and the independent non-execs will come in and they're all from a regulatory or a banking background, and having that balance between experience in banking and regulation and the kind of entrepreneurial spirit on the other side of the table is a really powerful combination. But it requires people meeting in the middle, really, and that's largely achieved through really proactive work from our directors that come to the office and have one-to-ones with middle management and feed their experience directly into the company.
It's very interesting because I think Monzo is one of those brands that has built a massive amount of credibility for itself, with its customers, but with the industry, with the wider environment, by behaving like a mature, grown-up company in a lot of respects, but at the same time being extremely innovative. And from what I can see, it's one of the exceptions in the space. Is there any kind of common risks or common potholes that you see perhaps other startups and scale-ups falling into that maybe haven't taken some of these lessons on board? I can't think of many companies, early-ish stage companies, who have a role like yours.
I mean, part of it is kind of forced by the fact that we're a bank and we have to have a much higher level of governance than another type of company. On balance, that's actually been a very positive thing. But also, it's always just been part of the mission of Monzo, really, which was to reintroduce trust and transparency into banking. By essentially using those kind of values as a North Star, then the way we make decisions just kind of follows that, oh, you know what, we need to introduce a new type of charge, so we should go out to our community and ask for their opinion on it, like we did when we introduced charges for ATM withdrawals. And so instantly our customers and the rest of the wider community is thinking, oh, wait a minute, this is a company that are doing things differently. They're being transparent, they're trying to reintroduce trust into the relationship between a customer and its bank. And that means that actually complying with regulation or complying with the correct way of doing banking activity should just follow, actually.
It's almost the other way around, isn't it? It's that you're trying to do the absolute best right thing for your customer.
Yeah.
And it's almost like the compliance is the groundwork.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
That space. It's interesting.
And so when I joined to help with legal and compliance, I was expecting to turn up and say, no, crikey, what are you doing? You can't do this, you can't do that. And actually what I found was people doing things incredibly well and much more in line with the regulators' perspective of treating customers fairly and the management of conduct risk. Those were, completely through the culture of the whole organisation and continue to be so. And therefore it makes my job very easy when I say, oh, there's this little black letter piece of legislation that you need to follow, because ordinarily we're just almost like accidentally doing it anyway.
Yeah. Accidentally doing the best practices in the service of your customer.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which, if presumably more organisations did, the compliance would be less heavy-handed in the first place.
Well, quite. But in terms of kind of common risk potholes and things that I think there's one thing is having that very, very strong culture and having that social mission has definitely helped us, and it's meant that when governance and compliance and regulation have been introduced, they haven't felt like they're directly conflicting with what we're trying to achieve. There have been occasions where we've had to have some, interesting discussions, but that's a healthy tension to have. I think one of the things that I think most startups will identify with, and we're not immune to it at all, is there's always some fire going on that needs to be dealt with, and it's part of startup culture, I think, or so I've come to learn over the last year and a half, is to deal with the big problems first. What's the riskiest assumption you can test against? What's the major risk that you need to deal with? And the danger of that, I think, is the failure to compartmentalize the different types of risks that a company faces. So you go, right, there's a big risk here. Let's turn the whole attention of the company to fixing that problem. And then there's another risk. Let's turn the whole attention of the company to that problem. And it's the board's role to identify and make sure people aren't forgetting the other risks and the more subtle risks that are present. And so it can be quite difficult, I think, for a board to come in and say, okay, let's spend some time talking about your 7th biggest risk, when there are 3 major ones that everyone's dealing with.
And I can see why the founder would turn around and think, oh, that's an unnecessary distraction. But hearing it put that way and actually thinking about it from the person, the director asking this question, that's their job. It is kind of you as the CEO or you as the executive team. Yeah, I get why 80% of your attention is putting this big fire out over here, because it is really important we put this big fire out, and you have the teams that run triage. But actually, we're looking at the whole business and we're looking at on a non-reactive time frame, and we have to plan through. And actually, we're almost working on different thought cycles.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, and this is something that I think is a particularly interesting dynamic in founder-led companies, is what is a director thinking about that's different from a founder. So a founder is, usually quite a significant shareholder, but they're also an employee. Mm-hmm. You're a CEO, you have an employment contract. And
you can get fired and everything.
You can get fired, and the person that can do the firing is the board of directors. And the director has a different dynamic to play. They have a legal obligation to promote the success of the company for all of its shareholders, and one of those shareholders, or like a few of those shareholders, might be the founders. They might be significant shareholders, but they're not all of them. Mm-hmm. There's usually some VC money in there. There might be some other institutional investors. We for example have a whole bunch of crowdfunding
really?
investors. Yeah,
that's interesting.
And so the director has a legal obligation to think about, is this in the best interest of all of those shareholders? And if a director ultimately believes an executive is not the right person to carry out a strategy that acts in the best interest of all those shareholders, then they can, remove them or remove their delegated authorities or powers and so on. And that is quite a strange dynamic in a founder-led company. It's like, hey, this is my company. What are you?
Yeah. I've lived that dynamic. Yeah. It's a very strange dynamic.
But I think it's something that the founders have to be very, very respectful of and acknowledge and come to terms with quite early on.
Yeah.
But also is for the director to say, I'm here to help and guide and challenge. I'm a critical friend in this relationship. But ultimately, I'm the one who's next on the line on the success of this company. So you might be financially invested, but I'm legally invested.
Yeah. It's a really different dynamic, and I actually don't think it is one that founders, first-time founders, understand at all. Actually, yeah. I certainly don't think I particularly did, and I think that I didn't understand how to treat that suitably, respectfully, as you say, and I could have made that working relationship a lot more constructive, probably by doing the things that you're talking about, in that getting those directors spending a little bit more time with middle managers and seeing how those teams were making their own decisions and weren't suitably informed enough to do that, as opposed to being the conduit of all knowledge. And then you're also the single point of focus of everything, which is quite stressful in its own way.
Yeah. Well, I think because I've mentioned before that we have to have kind of full stack corporate governance here, and it works very well because it means that we have a chief risk officer who will report directly into the board risk and compliance committee. Similarly, I do also as the lawyer. Then you have someone that's responsible for internal audit, and they report directly into the chair of the audit committee. And so there is that corporate governance. There are those lines of communication, those voices that are different from the CEOs, and it means that you just get a really nice, rounded view of the world. Mm-hmm.
And yet you still have successfully kept your startup or your scale-up culture and vision, and you all feel like you're running up the same hill?
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly, the ability to go very quickly on things is really important to us, and the board get that, and I get that, and of course the executive get that as well. I talked before about how we have full stack teams that will execute against a particular problem. That's part of the overarching framework for how the board and how the executive and how me and other people get comfortable that things are being done in the right way, but also being done very quickly. We could have said, right, here are a bunch of product development processes or a bunch of change management processes, and if you want to change anything, you have to go through this central infrastructure. And
I mean, a long time ago, early in my career, every advert that I placed in the newspaper, I physically had to take the artwork every time to compliance and get it signed off, even if there was a courier waiting outside to kind of get it to the Daily Express or something for it to run overnight. I mean, it was just the most soul-destroying, inefficient possible thing.
Yeah. Well, Yeah, I work very closely with our marketing team here, who produce a bunch of articles and blog posts and so on. But essentially, if I'm satisfied that they know what they're doing, they're well educated, they run their own quality assurance, so they do their own compliance monitoring, then as long as I'm satisfied that it's effective and running well, then they can kind of run themselves. They don't need for me to come and check words on their adverts. And also, I think a really useful means of kind of product development or change management is testing and learning as you go. So, for a large bank or a large organisation, it's very difficult to do that because there aren't really isolated cohorts of customers to test ideas against. It's like, look, to take a change through the organisation, multiple stakeholders need to be involved to basically change the plumbing or change the platform or whatever needs to change. And a whole bunch of people need to approve it and sign it off, because that's how the organisation is managing its risks. We have a much more startup culture of that, which is to roll out a very simple, rudimentary, and quite often poor version of a product to 20 people, have some feedback, roll it out to 100 people, have some feedback, and 500 people, and so on and so on, until you get to a point where you say, actually, we've got so much feedback, we've learned so much that all of the things that you would have said to us had we come and brought this to you for compliance or legal approval, we've already thought about through our engagement with our customers.
Brilliant. Which
makes my life super, super easy. And I just say, okay, maybe think about this one more thing, one more thing, and off you go. I think that has to be reflected in the kind of agility of the organisation to be able to do that, but also the agility of our risk, how we do risk management. We're also very lucky in that we have a very highly engaged customer base, which has been driven in part by the missions around the mission of trust and transparency. So we have a very engaged community forum. So we can say on the community forum, look, we're thinking about launching a new idea. It's a bit buggy, it's a bit rubbish, but if you're interested in coming and testing it with us, and we have people queuing up to come and test our products, and it's because I think the reason why people are so keen to come and test our product, even when they're not working particularly great, is because they want to be part of this new story about banking. For example, when we first started launching our current account, it was a significantly inferior product to the prepaid product, which was our original product. And we had lots and lots of people that said, that's fine, I'm willing to give up my fantastic prepaid product because I just want to try out this current account. I just want to be part of the story. And so having that very highly engaged customer base and having a highly engaged community gives you that freedom to make those, get that forgiveness and buy-in from people when you're.
And that's what's keeping you as a startup scale-up company, because that's that classic process: test, iterate, learn, continuous feedback, nuancing, and pivoting, and not pivoting, but just iterating till you get that. You hit that sweet spot with the customer.
Yeah.
And that's clearly why this is working so successfully. I'm conscious of how much time I'm taking up of yours, and I don't want to overstay my welcome in your Pineapple HQ, which is a very nicely named room, and it does have pineapples in, if anybody was doubting. I can see another room over there that has, I think, ponies in.
Alpacas.
Alpacas, but we're in the pineapple room, and we have a fine selection of pineapples. Any final words of wisdom for our director, who is presumably going to have to go and find themselves on the path of diplomacy that you have so recently come to tread yourself?
Yeah, I mean, we were joking beforehand, Vicky, about how part of my role is to be a diplomat, kind of gliding between the board and the exco and the rest of the organisation. And I think a director has a similar role to play. And the soft skills and diplomacy and kind of creativity and thinking about how do you skin this particular cat. It doesn't just have to be through process, or it doesn't just have to be through bring a load of data to me so that I can satisfy myself. There must be other ways, particularly in a small company. And maybe it's, for example, having one-to-ones with middle management. Maybe it's having some games and fun around a particular point. So as an example, we're implementing GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, at the moment, and there are some interesting discussions around how we should operationally implement these things. And we thought, we could do a bunch of training, we could create some gap charts that put it together as a project, and we thought, maybe we should just run it as a series of debates, so that people are debating the hot topics around data protection regulation, and they've been really, really successful. And because they've engaged people much better than other ways. So, just thinking about other creative ways to solve the same problem. Sometimes and also, I think founders and people that work in startups are usually very, very smart. They don't need to have a lecture about things. They don't need to be given a bunch of training guides. I've found that quite often just asking an opposite curious question to a bunch of smart people just nudges them into a certain way of thinking, and then they just solve the problem themselves. And so actually that the role of the director to ask those interesting opposite questions at the right time, just to nudge people into the right direction, is I think very important.
Oh, very clever. So, yes. I'm going to keep an eye out for those future diplomatic manipulations. Thank you so much for your time, Dean. You've been listening to Vicky Brock and Dean Nash of Monzo, this week's Entrepreneur Agony Aunts. You can submit your question as ever at vickybrock.com/podcast.